Howdy everybody, welcome back to Ireland Bound. We are on chapter 5 today. That means that we'll be talking about my grandfather, Dick Rogers. And he was quite the character. He had a lot of interesting stories, and there's one really good one that I'm going to share with you today. And of course I'll do that in the middle of it because there's a few things that need to be said before we get to that. So anyways, I won't talk any longer, and I will let us get into the pictures so that you can get to know my grandfather a little bit better. Talk to you in just a moment. To say my grandfather had an interesting life is an understatement. When he was about a year and a half old, his parents divorced, and he and his mother, pictured here, moved back in with her parents. She got remarried and moved out of the house and moved on to her second husband's house. And her second husband's house, she had another son. About a month after he was born, she ended up getting sick and passed away. Both of her sons ended up in the care of her parents. And at the age of 12, Grandpa left home. That's another story entirely. He went down to New Mexico and he became a working cowboy on a ranch. He worked there 10 years, and then he and his brother Neil went up to the the northwest, and became lumberjacks. After a while of doing that, he came back down further south and joined a railroad crew, where he met my grandmother. That's another story entirely, which is better left for a longer segment. And let's just say that it was an interesting one in itself. And of course, as I mentioned, while he was on the railroad crew, he picked up a skill. He learned to weld, which helped him out in World War II. This picture that's coming up, this is crews that he helped train. Yep, that's right. A lot of women there too, isn't it? Okay, this is a good place to stop, because the picture I just showed you was taken around the time of the story that I'm fixing to tell you about. When my grandfather had moved his family to Concord, California, it was close to several military installations, and one of them was about 5 miles north of where they lived. It was a place called Port Chicago. If you have never heard of it, if you don't know the story of it, look it up. There was a TV movie that was made about it several years ago, so I mean there's stuff out there on it, so it's not an unknown thing. When Port Chicago blew up, the wave from it hit Concord, and of course Concord having a lot of natural gas lines supplying the different houses there with gas for hot water, for cooking, it blew out the pilot lights. Anybody who knows and understands anything about gas, you know and realize that if gas doesn't have the pilot light, it's going to fill the home up and possibly kill people. Now, when this happened like 2-3 o'clock in the morning. It was really, really late. Everybody was asleep, and so was my grandparents. When it happened, my grandmother just woke up and she was like, "Oh, it's just another earthquake." And my grandfather was like, "No," he says, "that wasn't an earthquake." And then all of a sudden it hit him. It was Port Chicago. He jumped up, he ran to the window and looked outside, and sure enough, there was a fireball rising into the sky where Port Chicago was. The training that he had as a district air raid warden kicked in. He knew what needed to be done, and he got my grandmother out of bed. He told her, he says, "We need to get up." He says, "The pilot lights are blown out." He says, "We need to get everybody up." And of course, my grandmother just did what he said. She got the kids up, got them outside. He turned out the pilot lights, or the gas line to the pilot lights, so that if something happened, it would be turned off, and opened up all the windows so that it could air out, so the house could air out. He ran outside. He went to one of his neighbor's houses, started pounding on the door. Finally, the neighbor came to the door, and it's like, "What's going on?" He told him, says, "Port Chicago is blown up." Says, "We need to turn out the pilot lights, and we need to open up the houses so they can air out and get the families outside." He says, you need to do this as fast as possible. And he says, I need you to help me. He says, I need everybody to help me. He says, for this one night, he says, I'm deputizing the whole entire community. He says, we all have to work together, and we've got to get everybody up, and we've got to get them out of the houses. He says, our two priorities, we've got to turn out all the pilot lights. We've got to turn out the gas to every single house that we come to. He says the second priority is to get people outside into the fresh air and away from the gas. He says those are the two things that we have to do. And he says, and to make it happen, he says, I'm going to deputize the whole entire community. He says, I need everybody working with me. He says, I can't do this alone. And he says, and we need everyone. So my grandfather started deputizing people, and he'd tell them, you go to the next house. If no one is outside, knock on the door, pound on it, pound on the walls, pound on the windows, whatever you need to do. Says, get people up. Says, if you don't get a response, if no one comes to the door, he says, you have full authority to kick the doors in. He said, and you pass it on. He says, this comes straight from me. He says, everyone has that authority. Everyone needs to check on everyone else. He says, I can't do it alone. We've all got to do this. And so they did. If someone wasn't already outside, they went to the next house. They pound on the door. They told everybody else. Everybody else went to another house who went to another house. The women, they were concerned also. They knew they couldn't kick a door down, but they knew they could pound on the doors. All of a sudden, my grandmother and one of the other neighbors became the babysitters, and all these women were dropping their kids off with my grandmother while they went and they pounded on doors also. They knew and they understood the importance of what was going on. They pounded on those doors, and if they didn't get anybody, they would grab one of the guys running down the street and they tell him, come help us, we can't get anybody to come. And they would knock the doors down. Said, if no one's at home, you go in. Says, you turn out the lights. Says, we got to make sure that there is no gas flowing from any of the homes. And they did that. Some people, they were sick enough they had to be taken to the hospital. But everybody lived. Everybody lived because of my grandfather's fast thinking and his actions, his realization that we need to move, and we need to move now. If he had been like my grandmother and thought, oh yeah, earthquake, and rolled back over, it might have been a totally different story. It might have been that it was Port Chicago and Concord. It might have been like a double bad thing that had happened instead of just one. But he managed to get everybody going. I remember my mom telling me after we had watched the movie about Port Chicago, she told me, she says, I was only about 8 or 9 years old. And she says, I remember Mama getting me up and I'm standing outside. She says, I have my nightgown on, I had a robe on, and I had house shoes on. And she says, I was watching all these adults running around, and they were pounding on doors, and everybody was coming outside. She said, I was so confused and I didn't understand. She says, I didn't know and I didn't realize. I mean, she was only 9 years old, but all these people lived because of the fact my grandfather had the forethought to say, we need to get everybody mobilized. If he had tried to do it all by himself, how many people would have died? And you know what? The neighbors cared enough about each other. They were willing to pound on the doors in the middle of the night. They were willing to bang on windows trying to wake someone up. And those that couldn't be woken, they were willing to knock down the doors. That is what a community is, and that's what they did. And I know in chapter 3, I told you about what my grandfather had done saving my mother's life. About him going into a burning building. I told you that that was his first act of heroism. This was his second one that I know of. The thing is, how many others were there? Those are the only two that I heard of. But someone like that, if they see something, they're going to do it. As far as I'm concerned, and as far as my mom and my uncle were concerned, my grandfather was a very special man. He was a very considerate man, and he was a very kind man. And as I said in chapter 3, he was definitely one of my heroes. So anyways, I will let y'all get back to the pictures, and I'll talk to y'all again in just a moment. As World War II ended, of course things started going back to normal for a lot of people, and eventually Grandpa loaded his wife and his 2 kids up, and they headed back to Texas. I mean, after all, he had his 2 children born there, and he just decided he liked it, and he just moved back. And he moved back to the North Texas area. In fact, they lived in Fort Worth for a long while. They lived there, they made lots of memories, they had lots of great times. And of course, he raised his 2 kids there. Both of his kids got married there, and divorced there, and widowed there after remarriage for second times for both of them. See that picture there? That's a catfish that Grandpa and his brother caught at the Lake Worth Dam, which was just down the road from them. That's a big catfish. I've got another picture that says how big it is, and I'll have to look that up sometime, but that was one big catfish. And of course, as I said, Grandpa loved Grandma. Anything that he could do for her, he did. She really was the love of his life, and he adored her, and she let him adore her. And they were married until he died. And I remember that very well because that was just a few days before my 9th birthday. That was a very hard birthday, honestly, to go through, losing someone who was so wonderful and as great as he was. I miss you, Grandpa. Okay, I hope everybody enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed some of the pictures. I mean, there were some pretty good ones as far as I'm concerned. So that is all about my grandfather that I have right now. I know there's a lot of other stories I could tell. In fact, I could probably do a whole nother episode on just my grandfather and some of the stories that I heard in my life about him. But I'll have to leave that here. And the next one I'm planning on doing, I'm going to do 2 people at once. Because, one, I don't have a lot of stories about either one of them, and I don't have a lot of pictures about either one of them. One of them was my grandfather's younger brother, a man named Neil Noble, and the other one was my grandfather's youngest uncle. This uncle of his, he was actually the first picture that I put up, was his uncle Enel. Enel was about 2 years older than my grandfather, and so they grew up together. And so I'm going to kind of combine them together into one video. Like I said, not a lot of pictures. It's just a little bit easier to do that. But I do have a little bit of interesting stuff on them. And so I figured, might as well round the family out because both of them, they were important parts of my grandfather's life at one point or another. Oh, and before I go, just a reminder, if y'all are watching for the first time or if you've been watching and you haven't done it yet, there is a big red subscribe button down there. I need y'all to hit it, and when it shows up, there's going to be 3 little bells that come up. Hit the top one that says all, and then that way anything and everything that I post, you'll be able to see and be able to keep up with what's going on. That is, if you want to continue on with me and find out more about my family and about the research that I'm doing into my family. So make sure you hit the all bell, and then go up and hit the like button. The one that's the thumbs up. That way it lets YouTube know that, hey, I enjoyed this video, and they'll go, hey, she's got people watching and she's got people liking it. You can't just watch, you gotta like too, so that way they know, hey, she's got something going on here. And I know I say that any of my family members that, you see pictures that you want, feel free to get a hold of me, and I will be more than happy to share. In fact, one of my cousins got a hold of me last week, and she was like, I've got to have some pictures of Daddy. And so I'm getting some pictures together for her. It's taken a little bit because I'm having a little bit of printer issues at the moment, but I will get those pictures together for her, and any of my other family members that they want some pictures, I will be more than happy to share, copies with you, and because I mean, this is your family too. And as I've also said, if you see any of these pictures of the other family members and you think, I've got one that looks a lot like that, or that person looks like this relative of mine, we might be related. Because there were actually quite a few Rogers family members out there. There's a lot of distant cousins out there that I would love to get a hold of you. I would love to be able to talk with you, and we can share information back and forth. I might have things, especially on my part of the family, that you didn't know that will help you with any research you might be doing, or you might have stuff that I need to help with some of the research that I'm doing. So I will be more than happy to talk to you, and we can discuss things. Just go down to the comments section and say, hey, this is my name, that looks like my uncle, my aunt, my cousin, whoever it is that you think they look like. And like I said, we'll go from there, and we might be able to exchange some information and make contact with long lost family members. So until next week, whenever I talk about two of my distant uncles, I guess I hope y'all have a good week, and I'll talk to you then.